The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. I sat there, in the defendant's seat, my hands sweating slightly. My lawyer, a seasoned man named Edward, had been whispering encouraging words, trying to calm my nerves. I wasn't a stranger to the legal system, but this time felt different. There was a weight to it that I couldn't explain. Judge Thompson, a woman known for her stern demeanor, called the session to order. She was an older woman, her short blonde hair perfectly styled, and her black robe clung tightly to her frame. The moment her eyes met mine, I felt the unsettling heat of judgment. There was something about the way she looked at me, something that made me uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter, we'll be proceeding with your case shortly. I trust you're ready for this." Her voice was sharp, almost dismissive, like she didn't believe someone like me belonged in her court. I didn't flinch, though. I knew what this was. People like her thought they had all the power, that they could make decisions without ever considering the real human being sitting in front of them. I wouldn't let her get under my skin. "I'm ready, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. She smirked, clearly unimpressed, and turned to the prosecutor, a man who had been far too eager to lock me up for reasons I couldn't fully grasp. The courtroom was filled with tension. But I wasn't worried. I had a plan. And it wasn't going to play out the way she thought it would. The prosecutor began laying out his case, droning on and on about the charges against me. It was the same old routine, one that I'd heard countless times before. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just going to sit quietly and let them do what they wanted. I had learned a lot over the years, and it was time for them to see who they were really dealing with. Judge Thompson didn't make it easy, though. Every time I spoke, she interrupted. Every time I made a point, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. It was as though she didn't even care to listen. "You've been arrested multiple times before, Mr. Carter," she said, flipping through her papers, barely looking at me. "This is nothing new for you." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I was no criminal, and I certainly wasn't going to be painted as one in front of everyone. But I kept my calm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is different," I said, trying to remain composed. "I was wrongfully accused, and I'm here to clear my name." She gave me a cold, almost mocking look. "Oh, please. Spare me the sob story. I've heard it all before." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "Perhaps you think you can charm me with your words." Her eyes glinted with a strange satisfaction. There was something about her tone, something that felt dismissive, like I didn't matter, like I was just another case to her. But I wasn't just another case. Not today. I stood up, feeling a surge of power I hadn't expected. "Actually, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying more weight than I'd anticipated, "I think you're the one who's forgotten something." The room went silent. Even the prosecutor, who had been so eager to speak, stopped mid-sentence. The air was thick with anticipation, and Judge Thompson's smirk faltered for just a second. I could see the moment her confidence wavered. For years, she'd presided over cases, shutting down defendants with nothing more than a few harsh words and a stern gaze. But today was different. Today, I wasn't the one who was going to back down. "Your Honor," I said, stepping forward, my voice now firm, "I have nothing but respect for the law, but I can't let you stand there and belittle me. I've been patient, and I've been respectful. But this is no longer about the case. This is about you trying to assert dominance over me." A murmur spread through the courtroom. I could feel the eyes of the spectators on me, but I didn't care. I wasn't backing down. I could see the frustration on Judge Thompson's face as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You seem to forget something, Your Honor," I continued. "This is a court of law. You are not above the law." The judge's eyes narrowed. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and I knew she was considering her options. But I wasn't done yet. "And," I added, a small, knowing smile on my face, "I'm not just any defendant. You might want to check who's really in charge here." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the bailiff glanced at the judge, unsure of what to do next. It was clear I had everyone's attention now. Judge Thompson, the woman who had mocked me for so long, was starting to realize that her control over this courtroom wasn't as absolute as she thought. But it was just the beginning. Judge Thompson's face turned a shade of crimson that I hadn't seen before. She was no longer the confident authority figure that had walked in this morning. Now, she looked rattled, disoriented. The smirk that had been on her lips earlier was gone, replaced by a forced tightness in her jaw. "You've crossed a line, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a tremor in it. "You have no idea who you're speaking to." I didn't flinch. I was in control now, and I could feel it. The way the tension was shifting, the way people were suddenly looking at her instead of me, told me everything I needed to know. "You're right," I replied calmly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I don't. But you should know exactly who I am." I turned slightly, glancing over at my lawyer, Edward. He was already standing up, a knowing smile creeping onto his face. "Your Honor," Edward spoke up, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room, "I believe there's something you need to understand." The judge's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze sharp, but she didn't speak. Edward walked over to the desk where he had left his briefcase, and after a moment of rifling through the papers, he pulled out a manila folder and slid it toward her. "This is a copy of Mr. Carter's legal background," Edward continued. "And I think you'll find something interesting in there." Judge Thompson hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder for a long moment. It was clear she didn't want to open it, didn't want to acknowledge whatever was inside. But she did. Slowly, reluctantly, she picked up the folder, flipping it open. I watched her expression shift as she skimmed the pages. First, confusion. Then, disbelief. Finally, a flicker of recognition, though it was barely visible. You can't be," she stammered, the first sign of vulnerability I'd seen from her. But it was too late for her now. The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of the folder's pages. Judge Thompson's hands were trembling slightly as she read through the contents. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, and the color drained from her face. She couldn't hide the shock. Whatever she had just read was far from what she had expected. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking as if she were no longer in control. Edward leaned in, his voice steady and unflinching. "That, Your Honor, is a list of Mr. Carter's credentials, along with his ties to this very city, ties that you're very familiar with, if you take a moment to remember." I took a small step forward, letting the words hang in the air. I wanted to savor the moment. "You see, Judge Thompson, while you were busy dismissing me, you overlooked one very important detail." She was still holding the folder, but her eyes were now darting back and forth, scanning the contents more carefully, her breathing shallow. It was clear she was piecing things together, but I wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. "I'm not just any man you can look down on, Judge," I said, my voice cold now. "I've got connections, and I've been working closely with people you would never dream of crossing." Her eyes flicked to me, and I could see it in her expression. She realized her mistake. It wasn't just a matter of me having a record, or even having a strong legal case. I was more than a defendant. I was someone with a story, someone with power. As she stood frozen, trying to process what was unfolding, I walked over to the side, where the bailiff had been standing, and I pulled out the last piece of the puzzle. "Why don't you take a look at this too, officer?" I said, handing him a document that had been sitting in my briefcase all along. He took the paper with hesitation, looking from me to the judge. Then, his face changed too, his eyes widened in recognition, and he quickly averted his gaze. "Everything checks out," Edward said quietly, his words now directed at the judge. "I think it's clear now, Your Honor. Mr. Carter is not someone you should have underestimated." The courtroom was now on edge. Everyone could feel the shift. The judge, once towering over everyone in the room with her authority, was now a shell of her former self. The prosecutor was sitting back, his mouth slightly ajar, unable to find words. Even the bailiff, who had been so attentive to the judge's every command, seemed lost in the whirlwind that was unfolding. Judge Thompson stood there, frozen, the manila folder in her hands, but her mind clearly miles away, piecing together the revelation. I wasn't just a random man caught in her court, I had connections, power, and a story that had just caught her off guard. But I wasn't finished. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the judge, my gaze unwavering. "You don't get to stand there and mock me, Your Honor. You've misjudged me for the last time." The judge opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she stumbled back, as if the very air had turned heavy with the weight of her own realization. Edward, sensing the tension rising, spoke again, his voice firm. "I believe it's time for a different kind of justice, don't you think, Your Honor?" And that's when it hit her. She realized what was coming, but it was too late. The pieces fell into place in her mind, and the truth was undeniable: she had crossed a line, one that no amount of power could protect her from now. Before she could say anything else, I reached for my phone in my pocket and made a call. The room had gone dead silent, the only sound the soft click of my phone as it connected. "Hello, this is Mr. Carter. I need you to send a unit down to the courthouse immediately. Judge Thompson is under arrest for misconduct," I said, my voice cool and controlled. The words echoed through the still room, and the realization hit everyone in the courtroom at once. The law was about to be served, not just to me, but to the very woman who thought she could control it. The judge's face turned pale, and for the first time that day, she seemed truly afraid. The sound of the phone call still lingered in the air, hanging like a heavy fog. The room was absolutely still now, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. Judge Thompson, who had spent years presiding over others, now found herself on the other side of the law. Her eyes darted to the prosecutor, who sat there, speechless, his hand frozen mid-air as he reached for his notes. The bailiff stood still, his gaze flickering between me and the judge, as if trying to make sense of the turn of events. And Edward, my lawyer, stood by, arms crossed, looking at the judge with a quiet sense of satisfaction. For a brief moment, it felt like time had frozen. The judge's hands trembled as she lowered the folder and slowly straightened her posture, her face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. I don't," her voice faltered. I didn't give her the chance to finish. I knew what she was going to say, what every person like her would say when they realized their power was slipping away. The excuses. The denials. The attempts to regain control. But there would be none of that today. "You don't get to do this anymore," I said, my voice steady. "You don't get to mock me, belittle me, or dismiss me like I don't matter. You've misused your position, Judge. And now, the law is going to do its job." I could see the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. The arrogance that had defined her was gone, replaced with the sharp sting of reality. The room, once filled with the heavy scent of authority, now reeked of defeat. The door to the courtroom opened with a soft creak, and 2 officers stepped inside. They didn't need any introductions, they were here for one reason, and one reason only. The judge's fate was sealed. "Judge Thompson, you are under arrest for misconduct and abuse of power," one of the officers said firmly. Her eyes went wide, a mix of disbelief and fear crossing her features. She tried to speak, but no words came. It was as though her voice had failed her, the weight of her own actions catching up with her in that moment. The officers moved toward her, and she didn't resist. She stood there, still as stone, as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of the metal clasp, which felt like the final nail in the coffin. The once unshakable judge, now a defendant, her own freedom slipping through her fingers, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face a portrait of defeat. As the courtroom doors closed behind Judge Thompson, a palpable shift occurred. The tension that had hung in the air now seemed to dissipate, replaced by an uneasy quiet that settled over the room. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. The crowd in the gallery, once filled with whispers and hushed murmurs, now sat in stunned silence. They had just witnessed a moment that few would believe unless they had seen it with their own eyes. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I had just done. My hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, were now steady. Edward gave me a small nod, as though he was silently congratulating me for what had just unfolded. I knew he had been preparing for something like this, always the strategist, always thinking several steps ahead. The prosecutor, who had been so eager to see me convicted, now sat with his head lowered. He seemed to be grappling with the realization that the tables had turned, not just for me, but for everyone who had underestimated me. As I walked out of the courtroom, the bright fluorescent lights above seemed almost surreal. The world outside felt different now, and I wasn't the same man who had walked in just hours before. The power dynamics had shifted. And for once, I felt in control. I made my way to the lobby, where my lawyer caught up with me. "That was incredible," Edward said, his voice low but filled with admiration. "I didn't think you'd go that far." "I didn't plan to," I admitted. "But sometimes, you have to make a stand, and you can't wait for the right moment to come to you. You have to create it." Edward grinned. "Well, you certainly created a moment today." Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, almost. The chaos that had seemed to follow me for so long was suddenly gone, replaced with something that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was justice. Maybe it was something more. I glanced back at the courthouse doors, knowing that the echoes of today's events would reverberate for a long time to come. Days passed after the courtroom incident, but the ripple effects of that moment were far from over. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines about the fall of Judge Thompson, the woman who had once wielded the law like a weapon. The headlines weren't kind to her. Her arrest was splashed across every news channel, every social media feed. The people she had once looked down on now had a voice, and it was louder than ever. But none of that mattered to me anymore. The court case had been dismissed. The charges against me were dropped. I was free, but not just free in the legal sense. I was free in a way that meant something deeper. I spent the next few weeks meeting with journalists, giving interviews, and making sure that my side of the story was heard. The narrative had to be clear. This wasn't about a personal vendetta or revenge. This was about righting a wrong, about holding those in power accountable, even when they thought they were untouchable. But there was one moment that stood out more than the rest. It happened when I received a phone call from one of the top judges in the city. She had heard what happened, and instead of adding fuel to the fire, she did something unexpected. She offered me a position, a role working with the city's Judicial Review Board. "You've shown the kind of integrity this city needs," she told me over the phone. "We need people who understand that justice is not a one-way street, and it's time for a change." I sat back in my chair, staring at the phone in my hand. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation to make sure that what happened to me could never happen again. To change the system, to be part of something that could truly make a difference. It wasn't easy to accept. The power structures that existed in the city, the ones that had looked down on me, would be difficult to navigate. But I had already made one impossible choice. And it was time to make another. A week later, I stood in front of a new crowd. This time, it was a room full of people who were looking to me for answers. For guidance. I knew what I had to do. "Justice isn't a game," I said, my voice steady, "and no one should ever believe they are above it."